This is a story that my mother and aunts told me when I was in high school. I'm 21 now, and it has never left me. I think about it constantly and ponder over what happened. My grandfather passed close to a year ago in June of 2020. He was 96 when he died, and it caused some issues in my family. They don't really pertain to the story, but there are some things about him that I have to share in order to explain the story in the best way. My grandfather, John, was a man who was extremely calloused and old-fashioned. He was bitter, abusive, and a complete macho man. My mother was raised never showing emotion or pain due to his abuse and lack of compassion for others. He had many secrets in my family that are now coming to light after his death. Everything that happened around him was brushed off and forgotten because he had more important things to do, like drinking or having affairs. Just an overall intense and very no-nonsense type of man. He was also not religious at all and found things like faith or hope stupid. This story takes place sometime in the 70s, most likely early to mid-70s. My mom was born in 65 and remembers this story clearly. My aunts, as well, remember this happening, but nobody knows exactly what year. One summer day, John decided to take his family on a small outing with the intent to have a picnic in the woods. My mother, her 3 sisters, and her mother and my grandmother were all there and very excited about this. Where we're from, my family is more accustomed to the woods and has lived in this area for generations. Going into the woods for a fun family activity was nothing out of the ordinary and seemed to be just another normal day. They made their way down a dirt backwoods road and stopped once they found a clearing large enough to accommodate them. As all the kids started jumping out of the car and messing around, as kids do after being stuck together, my grandmother began unloading their food and picnic supplies. John began surveying the area and deciding where to set up. As he was doing that, something in the woods past the clearing caught his eye. Before going to see what was out there, he yelled to the family and said he would be right back. The kids and my grandmother thought not much of this, since they're all used to the woods, and these woods in particular were very familiar to them. They continued unloading and setting up the stuff that they had brought. One of the girls pointed out something in the clearing that caused a sudden shift from a normal day to something worse. It was a dirt mound that looked like something was buried under it. This mound was about the size of a small person, maybe even child-sized. It was too big to simply be any animal in these woods. There were nothing but squirrels and raccoons in the area. Scattered amongst the mound were larger river rocks. There was no pattern, but they were definitely placed on the mound intentionally. Also, the dirt seemed to be fresh, as though just buried. It was loose and slightly darker than the area around it. The mood immediately shifted to something dark. My grandmother became concerned and told the girls to stay away from it. She was clearly upset and worried about it, but did her best to ignore it. The girls, all being children, didn't have the same amount of worry and continued playing while just avoiding the mound. They tried to return to their picnic, and the girls were already chasing each other in circles again. It was supposed to be a joyous, sunny day, and my grandmother wanted to keep it that way. Things seemed to return to normal for a beat. The trees around them created a wall of dense foliage, blocking their view from anything inside the forest. One of the girls again took notice of something strange. It was clear immediately what it was. Along one of the long branches of the tree hung a noose. It was tied with a rope and hung high above their heads. A lump of dirt can be explained away by nature, but someone had to have placed the noose there. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks when she first saw it. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. They couldn't just pack up and leave. John was still out in the woods. Even children can recognize a noose as a symbol of death. The children started to become very anxious. Whatever innocence was keeping them from worrying about the mound had completely vanished. My grandmother, the resilient woman that she is, soothed her children, and told them that it was just left by deer hunters. But she knew in her heart that they needed to leave. No deer hunter would hang a deer and then bury it. At least, no sane deer hunter. It wasn't until they started hearing something in the woods that they really began to panic. My grandmother, as well as all the children, began hearing a rhythmic chanting from deep inside the woods. It sounded as though there was a group of people all singing in deep voices to the beat of a drum. It went in a quick bum-bum-bum pattern. 3 steady beats followed by a pause, and then it would repeat. It sounded far away, but immediately fear began to take hold of each of them. They each listened and gathered together. As the seconds passed, it began to increase in volume. It was getting not just louder, but closer. What started out as a distant echo soon began to engulf the entire clearing. My grandmother was terrified and wanted so desperately to leave, but John had yet to return. They waited, fear-ridden, as the sound began to fill their chests. It felt like they were at a concert as the deep bass began to vibrate within them. It was everywhere and constant, as though the sound was being made by the trees themselves, surrounding the family in every direction. Suddenly, the sound of yelling broke through the constant drone of chanting. John's voice was yelling out to them from the trees. "Go," he yelled. "Get in the car." He came running out of the woods, yelling that they needed to leave. They had never seen terror on this man as they had at that moment. He was a man afraid of nothing, unbothered by the world around him. This was in fact the most emotion any of them had ever seen from him. He saw something in those woods, something that shook his very being to the core. My grandmother began throwing everything back in the car as the kids got in as well. John and my grandmother picked up their things as quickly as possible and threw it all into the car. They had no care for the things that they were packing up due to their fear. Food was all over the trunk. Items were broken. After everything was tossed in, they both got in the car and drove away. This is where the main grunt of the story ends. But one fact from this story is what really has caused me to wonder all these years. My grandfather has refused to ever speak of what he saw. He never told any of the children, or even my grandmother. Every time this was brought up, he quickly rebuffed it and angrily told them never to ask again. He never went to the police or told someone outside of the family. My grandfather is the only person who knows what happened that day. When I first heard the story, I swore to myself that I would ask him one day. Now I can't, and I regret it greatly. By the time I was in high school, he had moved out of the state with other family members, and I mostly lost contact with him, outside of occasional happy birthday calls or letters. This story doesn't have an answer to go with it. When he died, the only thing I was sad about was never knowing what happened that day. We weren't close when I got older, and once I learned of all of the abuse he caused, I separated myself from him. His death looms over me, and this story still haunts me. My mother and aunts just look back on it as a spooky memory from their childhood. Nothing more than a story to spook the little ones at Thanksgiving with. I'm one of the only people in my family who is still curious about what happened. I've always been interested in mysteries, horror, and conspiracy theories. This story piqued my interest more than any others in my family. This isn't the only strange story from my family, but it is definitely the strangest. I wish I had answers, but I hope you all find this story as fascinating as I do. When I was a teenager, my family moved into a new house in Ohio. Well, it was new to us. As soon as we moved in, my mother started saying that she felt the house was haunted and that she could sense a presence there. She said she heard somebody call her name and felt somebody put a hand on her shoulder. One time, she woke up with somebody holding her feet down, and she couldn't shake off whatever it was, so she started screaming. She also heard muffled voices. We didn't believe her at all. until both my sister and I started experiencing strange things. My first experience was when I was reading a book in my bedroom at 3 a.m. I'm a night owl, so this wasn't that unusual. Everyone should have been asleep, but suddenly I hear very heavy footsteps right outside my bedroom door. They were too heavy to be my mom's or my sister's, so I just assumed that my dad was walking around, checking up on us. I sprinted to the door, and when I opened it, I was shocked to discover the hallway was dark, and nobody was up. Our attic had several feet of fluffy insulation covering the entire area. There was nothing stored there, but at times you could hear steps coming from the attic, running up to the side of the house. They always ran up to the side with the driveway, as though they were trying to see who arrived, and this happened almost every time that somebody would pull up to the house. In the daytime, it was almost cool, but in the nighttime, it was terrifying. There was always something clicking loudly under my bed and in the closet at night, and I always tried to convince myself it was the air vents. However, all the air vents were on the other side of the bedroom, and they never made clicking noises. I sometimes saw an outline of a person standing next to my bed if my head was covered with a sheet, but when I pulled the sheet off, nobody was there. I heard sighs, as though somebody was standing right behind me, and one time I heard a whisper that said, "Come play." I prayed a lot, and that usually helped. I would also ask them to quiet down, and that helped as well. One time, my boyfriend and I were doing homework in the basement and heard the garage door open and voices of my parents in the kitchen. We ran up to say hi, only to discover an empty house. Another time, my boyfriend stayed overnight in our house and he slept in the living room. In the morning, he asked if we were all playing a joke on him at night, as he kept hearing a ball bounce on the stairwell leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor and in the kitchen. But every time he got up to see what was going on, no one was there. I don't think we even owned a ball, and we certainly didn't play with one in the house. One time, my mom heard a baby crying outside of our house at night. We lived in a safe and perfectly normal suburb. There was no reason that a baby would be in our backyard. Another day, a lid flew off of a cooking pot and got halfway embedded into the kitchen ceiling. It wasn't a pressure cooker, it was just a regular lid and pot. Another time, we left for a family vacation, and my boyfriend was asked to take our paper in. He said that he was in the house and decided to make my bed for me. We had left at the ungodly hour of 5 a.m., and I never got to it. He said at first he got a juice and felt like somebody was breathing down his neck in the kitchen. He kept turning around to find nobody there. Then he walked upstairs, and while he was making my bed, he felt something grab his legs from under it. He got freaked out and ran out of there, and he refused to enter the house again. He just diligently hid the papers behind a flower pot outside until we returned. One night, my sister woke up to a black caped figure standing silently in her room. She said there was also a bright orb near her window. Her windows faced the backyard and trees, and being on the second floor, there was no possible source of light from cars and things like that. She covered her head with the blanket, and when she looked out, the figure and the orb were still there. She went back under the blanket, and after some time, they were finally gone. One day, our cat disappeared without a trace, and we never did see it again. Not sure if that was related. My dad was one person who never experienced anything. No voices, no steps, no TV and radios blasting out on their own. He is hard of hearing, so that could be a factor. But one thing he can't explain is waking up at 4 a.m. next to a lit tea light candle that he swears burnt out at midnight. The candle was right in front of his face, and he's extremely sensitive to light, to the point where he covers any electronic lights with napkins because they disturb his sleep. It eventually got so bad that I refused to sleep in my own bedroom, as I could feel someone move around the room at night, and I slept in my sister's room. My dad decided to call a medium, and the guy said that there were 5 spirits in the house: a boy, an old lady, a couple, and a very angry man. He gave us a giant candle with a cross and said to burn it in the bedroom of the youngest child, which was now also my bedroom, where I slept in a sofa chair. The candle was in a big glass jar and was hefty. All night it kept shaking, and the glass kept making clicking noises against the counter that it stood on. We were also to tell the spirits that this was our house and that they needed to go to the light. Things improved after the visit, and shortly after I moved out to attend college, where I slept for years with the lights on, although I never experienced any paranormal activity in my apartment there. After college, I never stayed in the house for longer than a few days, always sleeping with the lights on, as that creepy feeling remained, although nothing notable happened anymore. Eventually, my parents sold the house. Where I live, we have had relatively few bid cases. There were almost none at all back in the fall. Because of that, although we were still living under certain restrictions, we had more public health sanctioned freedoms than many other places. For example, at the time, we were permitted to share our social bubble with one other household and travel within our region. My family and our fellow bubble family decided to take advantage of this by going on a fall getaway. We rented 2 side-by-side cabins in a beautiful waterfront wooded area and had a lovely, relaxing weekend. Although there were other cabins nearby, most were not occupied, and we saw no other people, although we did hear a dog barking a few times somewhere not far off. On our final night there, my son decided to sleep in the other cabin with his bubble siblings. Around 11 p.m., he called over, asking for some forgotten thing. It was a very dark night, and there were certainly no streetlights in the deeply wooded cabin area, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked the short distance to the neighboring cabin to deliver whatever it was that he needed. On the walk back, I heard a whistle. It was a very human-sounding whistle, exactly the kind of whistle one makes to call in a dog. It sounded very close, but shining my light around, I saw nobody. I heard it again, and assumed someone was whistling for the dog we'd heard earlier, so I didn't think much of it. A short time later, another call came from next door. My son couldn't settle and wanted to come back to our cabin. This time, my husband and I both walked over, collected our child and his stuff, said goodnight to our bubble family, and walked back. We heard the same whistle again, several times. It seemed to be on the dirt road ahead of us, moving gradually away. My husband commented that the dog must have gotten loose, and the owner was out looking for it. Inside our cabin, we continued to hear the whistling, coming at irregular intervals of maybe 2 to 4 minutes. At first, it would be loud and seemed quite nearby. Then, it would gradually grow fainter, then stop, as though the whistler had moved out of earshot. Then it would seem to circle around, coming from the other direction, getting louder as it moved past our cabin, then fading again into the distance. Then it would start all over again. Still not thinking much of it, my husband climbed into the loft to go to sleep, while I started to pack for the trip home the next day. Our son was sleeping in a little room on the main floor to the left of the front door, and the small window in his room was cracked open to let in the unseasonably warm night air. I was standing by that window, quietly gathering his scattered things, while the whistle once again drew closer. But this time, instead of fading as it passed by, the next one was very close and incredibly loud, as though the whistler was just outside my son's window. The blind was down, but I was sure someone was on the porch, right outside. I leapt to the front door, flung it open, and threw on the porch light, ready to tell off some prankster on our doorstep. Nobody was there. I grabbed my flashlight and took a few steps out past the circle of light, then thought better of it and retreated inside. I locked up the cabin, closed and latched all the windows, and lowered all the blinds. If someone was creeping around outside our cabin, I didn't want them looking in at us from the darkness. Deciding that I did not want to leave my sleeping son downstairs by himself, I settled on the sofa with a book. The whistles continued. Between each one, I would convince myself it was just a bird or an animal, only to hear it again and be certain that it could only be a human sound. The irregularity of it and the slight variations in pitch and tone also told me that it wasn't something mechanical or electrical or automated. Around 1:30 in the morning, my husband suddenly got up and started to get dressed. I asked him what he was doing. "I'm going to find out whoever that is and ask them why they've been whistling for hours," he said. I was horrified. My husband is a pretty big guy, and I was as curious as he was. But I also felt deep in my bones that it would not be safe for him to go outside that night. I insisted that he go back to bed, and thankfully he did. I sat vigil, listening to the intermittent whistles for at least another hour, until finally I dozed off on the sofa. When I awoke, it was morning. The sun was peeking around the blinds, and the whistling had stopped. I cautiously peered outside, half expecting to see some sort of evidence of a nightmare intruder, but there was none. A little while later, we wandered next door, coffee mugs in hand, to get our friends' take on the mystery whistler. Amazingly, they had not heard a thing, despite the fact that the sound was so clearly audible in our cabin and would have had to have passed right by them. We couldn't understand how they hadn't heard it. At checkout, I asked the woman at the kiosk down the road about it, but she just looked at me strangely and said she didn't know what it could have been. When I got home, I searched for audios of bird calls common to the area, and then ones not common to the area, in the hope of finding that same whistle. Nothing I found was even close, and we still don't know what we heard that night, circling for hours and stopping just outside our cabin door. I've been debating with myself for months whether or not I should tell this story, and today, I finally feel like it's time. I need to tell people about this, and I need someone that knows about this to hear it. I lived in a farm around 4 years ago. From the moment we moved there, I could tell something was wrong. I felt uneasy in there, as if there was something constantly spying on me. A little detail about the place and situation. We didn't technically own the place. It was borrowed from a woman that was trying to sell it. Call it a demo. So we didn't have access to the house, and we slept in a wooden storage house. The farm itself was like this. There was a barbed wire gate that you manually had to move in the entrance, and in front of it there was an open, empty field with one of those outside washrooms to the right. Passing by it, there was a small group of trees, and then the place where we slept. Passing that was the actual house, to the left, and then the forest. In the forest entrance, there was a tree with a ripped plastic bag tied to its branches, meaning the bag was tied while it was still small. People used to do that here to mark something. And right in front of it, there was a mound. Someone buried something there. I moved there with 4 dogs, plus there was the dog that already lived there that we took care of. Our routine was to wake up at 5 a.m. and to go into the city so I could go to school and my parents could go to work. The first night we stayed there, I noticed my room was the only one in the entire house that didn't have a lock. I couldn't sleep because of the weird feeling I had. I stayed up all night and slept on my way to school. Then, things got weirder. The door started opening at night. I dismissed it as the wind. Cliché, I know. But it became more frequent and more violent. Then, still in the very first week, I saw it. It was a black humanoid figure with a white face. It was like the white face had empty eye sockets, and instead of a mouth, just had an empty cavity on its face. It stood on my door entrance, staring at me. I decided I would not sleep while I lived there. I couldn't bring myself to move or do anything, so I just kept staring at it, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Some nights later, it became impossible to pretend, because it started moving and doing things. It entered my room. It tapped on the window. It was a metal window that was right beside my bed. It started to slightly move things and kept being a general creep. Whenever I flashed light on it, it disappeared, but the eerie feeling stayed there. I started keeping a flashlight in my room and playing music to keep myself awake and calm. Eventually, of course, I started falling asleep during the day, and on some days I woke up with headaches and the feeling that my eyes had been pushed into my skull. I woke up with pain. Eventually, my parents got security cameras, because while we were in the city, some people entered the place to go fishing. There was a shortcut to the neighboring farm's lake through the forest. This is important because of what happened next. Then one day my aunt went to visit. She had some weird superstitions and said that the place had gold buried on it for some reason. She went to the forest and saw the mound under the marked tree I talked about before, and she decided it was a good idea to unbury it, and so we did. Bad idea. There's a certain feeling of digging dirt that differs from rocks or mud or clay. I learned that this day as I dug the hole. Then, after going through a small layer of fragmented rocks, I hit something soft and resistant that felt like leather. I hit it harder and pushed through it. Immediately after it, there was something hard with a complex and detailed shape. I tried to break through it, since my aunt insisted it was protection for the gold, and my parents were just whipping me into helping her. But it was no use, and it occupied most of the area of the hole, so we couldn't dig around it. It was like the hole was made specifically to bury it. My aunt said then that we should cover the hole. She didn't cover it and went home. That night was hell. There was no tapping on the window. There was a strong banging. The thing kept entering my room non-stop, and even the flashlight stopped working. I had to stay awake, feeling everything just pressuring me, pressing in on all sides. My door wouldn't close. That thing would make noise, and it would just be there, staring at me. All the security cameras stopped working the moment that it all started. There were 4 cameras, one pointing to the front of the house, one pointing to the washroom, one on the back that showed my window, and one that pointed to the forest. That morning, I went to check the camera footage, and all the cameras had stopped working, except for the one pointing to the forest. There was only static for all the other 3, but that one just had a small blur. After that night, it never appeared again. I still couldn't sleep out of the fear, but it never actually showed up again, and things got calmer. We moved out some time after that. I keep thinking about it even now, 4 years later. It was just too real, and there were things that were noticed by other people too. I especially keep thinking about that thing we hit while digging, and how that night was the worst. I keep asking myself if maybe we found a body or something haunted that was hidden for a good reason. Last summer, a good friend and I embarked on a backpacking trip through the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. As fairly experienced day hikers, we felt comfortable in the Whites for our inaugural overnight trip. While planning, my buddy Ellis figured we could hike to a backcountry campsite to make our first wilderness night a little more fun. I wasn't going to disagree. Beautiful views, historic trails, and a protected night in the dry river wilderness. I was stoked, to say the least. Before any hiking trip, I do a little internet search on the trails or shelters that I will be coming across. Throughout the mid to late 1900s, there were a series of these lean-tos up and down the dry river wilderness, meant for backpackers or through hikers really looking to escape the crowds in more popular areas of the forest. Though as time went on and the Forest Service had other more pressing matters, many of these shelters were dismantled, except for Dry River Shelter Number 3, the last remaining shelter in this wilderness zone. On the morning of our hike, I met Ellis at the trailhead.
Tales from the Break Room is a podcast about scary work stories, and I want to hear yours. Send me your scariest work story at elapsed sack of coffee beans in the back room. Don't worry, I shooed them away before we put that bag back to use. Speaking of creepy nighttime employment, I've got a compilation for you of a whole beanload of scary night shift stories that are sure to make you clock out until dawn. These are tales from the break room. The Chick-fil-A Flare, from Anonymous. I should begin by saying this is a true story, and as of writing this happened 6 months ago in mid-November of 2017. I was working at Chick-fil-A in my hometown in New Mexico. It's only a small town, with 5,000 people at the most, but that's enough background. It all started when I was called in to cover the night shift for a new employee who had not shown up for work. This was the third shift in a row, and my manager called me. I didn't mind going in because money is money, and I knew the other fellow employees I'd been friends with for a while were working, so I thought the time would go by pretty quick. Beyond them, there were 3 other staff members working as well, but I didn't know them very well. They'd only started in the last few months. I hadn't really worked up the courage to interact with them just yet. I'll assign them names for this story: Alex, Luke, and Eric. My 2 friends are Lucy and Sam. To be clear, Alex was the manager. That night in particular, things were a little strange. We didn't see anywhere near as many customers as we usually did, but I didn't mind. Maybe the workload would be a bit lighter that way, although the shift would be longer because of it. At around 11 o'clock, Luke and Alex walked out and went home, leaving Eric, Sam, Lucy, and myself to hold down the fort during the last hour of the night shift. Then, to our surprise, there was an influx of customers. In the span of 10 minutes, we'd served 20 customers, and it got a bit rushed. During the rush, Eric accidentally hurt himself, burning his hand on the grill. Lucy had to take him to the hospital, leaving me and Eric to finish serving the others, clean up, and close up at 12, when we were due to close. Apart from the influx of customers, everything went normally, except we were spread thin, and we had to stay behind an extra half hour to clean up after we had closed. Once we finished cleaning up, Eric left, and I closed things down for the night. I had been working there for 2 years, so I guess Sam thought he could trust me to do it. Anyway, I locked the door and proceeded to walk to my car. But before I could even get to my car, I felt something hit me in the back of the head. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a lounge chair. I tried to get up, but I couldn't move at all. The only thing I could compare that to was sleep paralysis. At this point, I was beginning to panic. 1,000 things ran through my head. Who did this? Why? Why can't I move? You know, the basics when you wake up in that kind of situation. I started to try and yell for help, but all that came out was an unintelligible mumble, kind of like someone speaking when they just had a stroke. It was at that point I heard a voice. Good, you woke up. My eyes darted to where the voice had come from. They were just outside of my range of vision, considering I couldn't even move my head or any muscle for that matter. By then, I was absolutely terrified. A million questions, a million thoughts rushed through my mind. Then, the person who had been talking walked out into the open. They were big. It was Eric, standing there with a surgical face mask. His eyes looked sinister, and he had a scalpel in his hand. I started to freak out. He proceeded to say, "Been wanting to do this for months." Without a second thought, he took the scalpel to my arm and started to slice, and it looked as if he had done it before. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't move, just whimper. Then, thank God, sirens and lights. It was the police. Eric stood up with the knife, unsure of what was going on, and in seconds the police had kicked the door down. In a flash, with Eric unwilling to drop his scalpel, the police shot him. Not long after, the paramedics arrived. The police had managed to stop the bleeding and had realized he had drugged me, a substance to prevent me from running and possibly bleeding out too. Perhaps he wanted me to watch him remove the flesh from my own body. I would later find out the only reason I was alive was because Lucy and Sam had returned to the store and noticed my car was still there. They proceeded to watch the security footage to find out where I went, and they saw that I'd been struck in the head by Eric. They called the cops right away. I also found out I was not his first victim. The person whose shift I had been covering was the first. He had missed his shifts because Eric had apparently killed him. Creep in my living room. From Anonymous. About 5 years ago, I was living in a small rural town in an apartment building that really had no business being where it was. It was about 3 miles out of town, down a country road with not a lot of houses on it. That being said, it was always quiet, besides the occasional drunk neighbor. It was a normal day. I'd worked third shift, so I slept when I got off work, unless I didn't have work the following night. On August 7th, a day I'll remember forever, I got off work, came home, and decided to just take a short nap because I had to run some errands that day. I woke up and got dressed and went to get in my car when I was stopped by my neighbor, Tyler. Tyler asked me what I was doing the night before. He explained he had seen me outside my apartment, messing with one of my window screens. I assured him I was at work the night before, and it was probably just some drunk idiot. I went on about my day, did what I had to do, and got back home around 8 p.m. I went inside and put my groceries away, and I decided to watch some TV. Honestly, I can say I'd forgotten about the whole thing by then. Between 11 and midnight, I decided to go to bed. I turned my TV off and walked towards the stairs. I made it about halfway up when I heard a loud bang come from the living room where I just was. I stood still for about 30 seconds or so, and that's when I decided to keep going up the stairs. Not 5 seconds after that, I heard the sound of my living room window practically exploding. Now, I'm a big guy, 6'4" and 280 pounds. That being said, I have zero tolerance for someone coming into my home. In my mind, they would take one look at me and run away. That wasn't the case. I ran down the stairs to see what was going on, and sure enough, there was a man about halfway through my window. I froze simply because I'd heard stories 100 times like this, but now it was happening to me. He hit the floor, stood up, and we locked eyes. The only thing that came out of my mouth was, "Get the hell out of my house." He had other plans. We stood there for what felt like hours just staring at each other. He had this paralyzing smile on his face. That's when I noticed the knife in his hand. I said out loud, "You take one step towards me, I'll kill you." He stayed still and said back, "If you were at work tonight, this wouldn't have happened." Right then, I knew this man was going to kill me, or at least try. I turned, ran up the stairs, made it to my bedroom, and slammed the door. My door doesn't lock, unfortunately, but I decided I'd be safe in here with my Smith & Wesson .45 that stays on my nightstand beside me. I dialed 911, telling the dispatcher what was going on. I can still hear her response to this day. "If your bedroom door opens before officers get to your house, you're within your legal rights to protect yourself." So now in my mind, it's game time. I thought to myself, "Open that door. I dare you. You're done." I couldn't hear anything downstairs, so I sat there in silence. About 5 minutes went by and I hear the police arrive. I opened my window and yelled out. I didn't know if he was still downstairs or not. They told me to stay put until they got to me. I threw my keys out the window so they could enter. Then I heard my front door open, and the police yelled, "Drop the knife! Get on the ground!" I would say another 2 minutes went by, and an officer shouted that I was good to come out. I went downstairs as they were taking him to the car. The female officer told me that when they came in my front door, he was sitting in the living room on my couch, just not doing anything. That really freaked me out. What was he doing? Why was he in my house? I now live about 40 miles away and haven't had any problems since, but this event still gives me chills. I guess all I can say is to arm yourself. You never know what might happen. In the case of this guy, it seemed he knew when I worked and thought I was gone that day. But why he just waited downstairs with a knife, I guess I don't know. Maybe he wasn't coming to rob me. Maybe he wanted to break into my house, wait for me to get off work, and stab me. Mom's Ghost Story. From Anonymous. This is a story my mom told me and my siblings. My mom used to work in an office building as a janitor, along with several other employees. On this night, she agreed to work the late shift and cover for a friend. She usually worked in the mornings and was almost always done by midday. She was assigned the job of cleaning the top floor, after which she would work her way down until about halfway. Before my mom had taken that job, some of her coworkers, who had been there way before she had, told her that the 8th floor of the building was haunted by a ghost that was said to cry horribly at around 12 a.m., startled but not too fazed by it. My mom just thought it was her new coworkers trying to scare her. After all, she was new and had only been there for a couple of weeks. She'd also told me that each floor had a dial that controlled the lights, and you had to set it to a certain time, after which it would reset, and all the lights would turn off one by one. She usually took about an hour on each floor, after which she would continue on to the next. Once she had finished up on the 9th floor, she made her way down to the 8th floor. There, she set the timer for an hour and began to clean. About 55 minutes in, she told me that, all of a sudden, she heard one of the most horrific, spine-chilling screams she had ever heard in her life coming from outside the hallways, It seemed to originate from one of the offices she was cleaning. Out of fear, she panicked, dropping all her things, and she ran for the elevator. From behind her, she could hear loud cries from a woman, something you would only imagine you'd hear in a horror film. As she desperately ran for the elevator, the lights she had set for an hour began to turn off one by one, leaving a trace of darkness behind. When she finally made it out, she made a phone call and quit the next day. I see dead people. From Anonymous. I live in a small town in Kentucky where nothing really happens. I'm a 22-year-old volunteer 911 operator, and I also have a sort of gift for seeing and hearing spirits. This happened around 4 years ago, and it's still going on today. I was working a late shift and decided to clock out a little early. I packed up my stuff and told my supervisor I was heading home. But then, one of the other volunteers came running in, telling us that a woman's car had been found abandoned, and the lady was nowhere in sight. The police went from place to place looking for this woman. Let's call her Krista. Krista had apparently been driving home on the BG, and the police say that her car must have broken down. Now, fast forward a year later, no one had seen or heard from Krista since that night she went missing. People in our town began to talk about how she must be dead, or maybe she ran away. The police did a full investigation and came up with nothing. Everyone suspected that her boyfriend Beau had something to do with her disappearance, but the police couldn't prove it. Now, all that happened about 4 or 5 years ago, and you're probably wondering what that has to do with me. Well, a few months back, I started to have these nightmares of a woman whose car broke down. She went to go look for help, but was abducted. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because at the time, I had no idea that Krista's car was broken down and that they believed she went to find help. I only knew that a woman's car was found on the side of the road. As time went on, the nightmares grew worse and worse. I kept having them, and each one had more and more details. The last one I had was of 2 men burying a body in the woods. I believe that Krista was murdered, and she's showing me where her killers buried her body. The Clown in the Elevator. From Alexis D. I now live in a big city after moving from a small town a few months ago. I attend college, and I'm working to get my bachelor's degree in criminal justice. I live with my mother and 2-year-old son in an old apartment building we just moved into. I thought the apartment building looked safe, but what happened to me about a week ago has changed my mind. I work the graveyard shift, going to work at 5:30 p.m. and usually getting off at 4 a.m. It was a couple of nights after Halloween, and my mom was at the apartment watching my son. A friend from work sometimes gives me a ride home, and he had just dropped me off. Being a young female and it being dark out in a big city is why he usually walks me to the door. I tell him thanks, then I reach for my key because the entrance doors of my apartment building are usually locked after 10 p.m., and tenants are only allowed to get in after hours. As I unlocked the door, I noticed that the knob turned, and the door was already unlocked. Funny, I thought to myself. The entrance doors to this place are never open like that. As I walked in, I decided to take the elevator. I got inside and put my key into my purse. With my head down, putting my key back, I suddenly heard someone step into the elevator with me. I lifted my head, and I got startled big time. There stood a man in a full clown outfit. The outfit was blue with white stripes going up and down. He wore huge blue clown shoes, a blue curly clown wig, along with a red nose and blue and red makeup, forming a smile. However, he did not have an actual smile on his face. His expression was nothing but a deep, blank stare. The elevator doors closed, and I say good evening to him, being the nice person I was. Suddenly, his deep blank stare turns into a sinister look. At me. As the elevator starts going up, I think to myself, what in the world is he doing in this building at this hour? Was someone having a party? But birthday parties usually don't go until 5 a.m., especially if it's a kid's birthday party, where clowns would often be present. I also noticed he was carrying a bag, which I didn't notice when he first stepped into the elevator. As he looked at me with that sinister look, he bent down to get something from that bag right when the elevator stopped at the 6th floor, the floor where my apartment was. The elevator doors open up, and I start stepping out, saying, "Have a nice morning," to him. As I say this, he looks up, and the sinister look turns into an even more sinister smile. He grabs something out of his bag and stands up. What he grabbed turned out to be a huge kitchen knife. I scream then, running from the elevator down the hallway, and I kid you not, this clown man chases me with that knife. I ran as fast as I could, being chased, the man laughing like a lunatic. Finally, I make it to my room and quickly grabbed my keys, opening the door, just as he reached me with the knife. I slam the door in his face and go straight to the phone to call 911. After I call the cops, I look out the peephole on my door, and I don't see anyone out there. My mom wakes up, and I tell her what happened and why I called the cops. When they arrive, the sinister clown is nowhere to be found in the building. The cops don't think I'm lying, though, because in the building right next to ours, a man had been spotted with the same kind of clown suit. He fit my description. A few nights ago, in the same neighborhood I live in, there was a murder in one of the houses. A woman was strangled to death, and a witness even said a clown was spotted in the area. Luckily, the police promised to patrol the area, and they continued to check the apartment building. So, creepy clown, please don't come near me again. Lady in the White Shorts, from M. Kintz. I live in Northwest Florida, and I work at the airport. I've been there for 20 years, primarily working the graveyard shift as a toll booth cashier. During the night, I use a handheld computer to enter letters and numbers from license plates for lost ticket purposes. Sometimes my manager assigns me to go to the garage for inventory, and I always feel uneasy about the 4th level. One night, as I was inputting information into my handheld, I looked up and noticed a woman standing near the edge of the garage. She was wearing a short-sleeved baby blue shirt and white shorts. She didn't move or look back, and her shoulder-length black hair framed her face. I couldn't help but wonder why she was wearing shorts when it was around 42 degrees outside. Nevertheless, I shrugged it off, continuing to enter in more license plates. A few seconds later, when I glanced up again, she was gone. I didn't hear any footsteps, and the sliding door that led into the lobby by the elevator didn't make its usual squeaking sound. I immediately informed my managers and coworkers about what I'd seen, but they looked at me as if I was crazy. Since then, whenever I go to the 4th level, I make sure to check my surroundings more attentively. The Dreams, from Safeside Baldwin. This happened to me 8 years ago, back when I was working in the rural towns of Arkansas. I worked the night shift at a local factory, so I slept during the day until evening. One particular day, while I was asleep, I dreamt that I was involved in a 2-car accident. Fortunately, no one was harmed. However, the passenger in the other car complained about injuring her neck from the crash. In the dream, I opened my wallet and handed the driver and passenger a few $100s before they drove away. When I woke up that evening, something told me to call in sick and stay home. However, being 19 years old and foolish, I ignored my instincts and went to work as usual. On my way home, I encountered a car that refused to let me pass, and unfortunately, we ended up in an accident, and almost everything I saw in my dream came true, from the beginning to the woman complaining about her neck. However, the part with the wallet full of hundreds never happened. Most people I've told this story to ignore or completely disregard my dreams, just as I did. That is until I met my now wife, and the dreams came back with a vengeance. While staying with my in-laws, my vehicle at the time broke down. I was brought home, went to bed early that morning, and that's when the second dream occurred. This time it was a trivial matter. I dreamt I had returned to my vehicle and it started on the first try, despite the obvious damage it had sustained the night before. The following night, before going to work, I decided to test my theory, to see if the dream was just that or something else. On my way to work with my sister-in-law, I stopped at my vehicle, hopped out, and sure enough, the vehicle started. It struggled a bit, but it started nonetheless. I was in tears when I returned to my waiting sister-in-law. The third dream deeply disturbed me. I saw myself visiting someone close to me while they were imprisoned. Not a day later, I kid you not, a family member I was close to was imprisoned, sentenced to 1.5 years. Another dream served as a warning about my sister. I clearly saw someone talking to me and someone else warning us to stay away. The entire encounter in my dream felt extremely dangerous and tense. A couple of days later, my mother called me to talk. She mentioned an upcoming trip. Right away, I tensed up, remembering that dream. I told her about it, asking her to warn my sister about the possible danger. Luckily, my sister took my advice and did not go off-roading with my stepdad. The events played out exactly as I'd seen them in my dream. Lately, the dreams have slowed down and almost completely stopped, but I still fear that when I sleep tonight, I'll have another dream. I'm terrified because I don't know if this next dream will be the one that tells me someone dear to my heart will disappear. Kroger store from Old Smoky. I've been working at a JC store in Indiana, and I'm pretty sure if you ask anyone who has worked the night shift at a grocery store, they've seen or experienced something strange. I've come across my own weird experiences, but one night always sticks with me. I was working from 4 to 9 due to the recent COVID-19 pandemic. 10 minutes before 9, it was just my manager, Sean, and me. Sean always felt better having me there with him since I'm a big dude, weighing around 250 pounds, and being built thanks to my life as a farm boy. So I went to do my rounds to count how many people were in the store before locking up. I didn't count anyone, so at the time it was just Sean and me. I went to the lobby to lock the door, and there I found this smelly, dirty-clothed man with messy hair. He said my name, then proceeded to tell me he had a special order for me. I told him I'd check in the back. The guy followed me into the back of the store, where only employees are allowed, and he started to get mad, asking where his stuff was. I asked him what stuff he was referring to. He said drinks. I searched all over but could not find these drinks, so I got on the intercom and said, "Shown to the back, please. Shown to the back." A couple of minutes later, Sean came in. I asked him if a special order had arrived and where it might be. He found it. It was on a stocking cart with 50 different kinds of drinks. We proceeded to go up front, and Sean told me if the guy tried anything stupid, tackle him while he calls the cops. When we scanned his items, he must have spent $500 on drinks. I asked him what all this stuff was for. He said he runs a store in town. It's all for his vending machines. I found that odd because he had also bought beer, and selling beer in a vending machine would be illegal. He then asked if I could help him load it into his car. We walked outside, and there sat a big black F-350 flatbed truck, waiting. The guy jumped into the back, and I began to load the drinks into the bed of the truck. Then, 2 other men came out of the truck, one with a pistol, the other holding something I could not clearly see. Throughout all of this, they asked me strange questions, like my age, whether I was married or had a girlfriend. I finished loading up. That's when I noticed one of the guys, the one with a pistol, getting back into the truck, followed by the other guy holding a double-barreled shotgun. I went inside and told Sean. He called the cops and explained what had happened. I clocked out. My girlfriend pulled up in my truck. On our way home in the dark, I noticed a truck with its headlights turned off, following us in the rearview mirror. I stepped on the gas, but the guy kept riding my tail. So I floored it, driving as fast as our truck could go. Suddenly, I saw red and blue lights behind us and I pulled over. The cop approached us and asked if there was a reason why we were speeding. As he asked, I saw the truck with those 3 guys from the store pass by. I told the officer, and he ran back to his car to go after that truck. We just went home. To all the night shift workers out there, be careful. You never know who might be crazy or not. Familiar Spirits. From Anonymous. My freshman year of college, I worked as a night shift nursing assistant for a rural hospital. The floor I worked on was the cardiac unit, which often received overflow patients from the ER and other areas. It was a fast-paced and intense work environment, where we dealt with very sick individuals and experienced deaths. The hospital was severely understaffed, and I often found myself as the only nursing assistant for 22 to 25 patients. I worked 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and this particular incident happened around 3 a.m. At the time, it felt as if the boundary between our reality and the spiritual world within the hospital grew thin. The unit was fully occupied, and I began my last round. As I entered one of my patients' rooms to take vitals, she started talking to me about a little boy in her bathroom. This patient had been in the unit for a while, and she didn't show any signs of confusion or altered mental state. Despite my initial disbelief, she insisted a little boy had walked into her bathroom when I entered the room. So I checked the bathroom, but there was no child. However, she was insistent and asked me to tell him to come back as she enjoyed his company. I reported the incident to my charge nurse, who spoke with the patient. I brushed it off and continued with my rounds, as again I had many patients to attend to. As I made my way through my rounds, I reached one of my last patients. She began to tell me about a man dressed in all white, whom she saw at the end of her bed. I assured her there was no man there. Similar to the previous patient, she didn't exhibit signs of dementia nor altered mental state. She continued insisting that the man wanted her to go with him. I reassured her there was no one there and promised to speak to her nurse. This patient became increasingly anxious. The nurse went in to talk with her, and the patient began describing people surrounding her room. In great detail, she described a large woman standing at the foot of her bed. The nurse informed me that the description matched that of a woman who had passed away in the same room a few weeks earlier. The patient was visibly anxious and upset. The nurse called the doctor, who ordered sleep medication for the patient. Throughout the rest of the night, the patient continued to press the call button, pleading not to be taken away. My shift ended and I had a class at 8 a.m. that morning. As a religious and spiritual person identifying as a Christian, I'll never forget that night in the cardiac unit and the patients reporting sightings of things that were not physically there. Hospitals are filled with people from all walks of life, and sometimes working there serves as a reminder of how real the spiritual realm can be. Creepy, disgusting drunk that got me fired. From Anonymous. I used to love my previous job. I used to work at a cafe inside of an airport. It was fun. I met so many different people, and the smell of freshly ground coffee was like Christmas to me. But that all changed one night shift. Despite the airport being filled with passengers, the situation I'm about to share is the only time I was truly scared. I'm generally a calm person, always finding a way to handle unruly customers without complaints. As I was minding my own business, a very rude person entered the coffee shop. Nothing wrong with that, right? The problem was, there were only young girls behind the bar, some of whom were very young and not good at handling difficult situations. One of them came to me and said, "You have to come here right now." Well, the man must have been over 2 meters tall, unusually hefty in my standards. He was screaming about drink prices. My first thought was, well, of course, what do you expect? So I stood there with a smile, trying to calm the customer, explaining to him that we are just workers who have no control over the prices. I even sympathized with him, acknowledging that the prices were indeed high. At first, it seemed like the fire was extinguished. The gentleman spoke in a normal tone, politely asking how to get to the bathroom. Kindly, I pointed it out, and he left. After about 5 minutes, the same gentleman returned with the same question. Since I realized I could handle it myself by showing him the bathroom, I offered to accompany him there. He thanked me, and as we reached the bathroom, I opened the door and cheerfully said, "Here we are." With a slight nod, he took a few steps, then suddenly muttered something, which I couldn't understand. He stared at me, and what happened next caught me completely off guard. He grabbed my head and pulled me into the bathroom with him. Before I could even comprehend what was happening, I found myself pressed against the wall, cornered with his elbow on my neck. Everything happened so fast, I struggled to grasp the reality of the situation. The man had pulled out a knife and pressed it against my cheek. I could feel the cold steel piercing my flesh inch by inch, fear rendering me speechless. Was this really happening? Was I really going to die due to the high price of coffee? Countless thoughts raced through my head. I remember hoping for someone else to enter the bathroom, thinking how unlikely it was there wasn't someone in here already, what with it being in a busy airport. I recall the man's laughter, the way he seemed to relish having me cornered. Time seemed to slow down, and the pain intensified, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. A surge of energy rushed through me, my blood pulsating with each beat. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes. Then I heard an angry and agonized groan, accompanied by the sound of metal. Evidently, this life-threatening situation awakened something primal within me, a fight for survival. When I regained awareness, I swiftly headed towards the door without looking back. My heart pounded so hard, it felt as if I were running a marathon. Thankfully, I never encountered that deranged man again, after apparently knocking him out in the bathroom. For the remainder of my shift, I was in shock, unable to concentrate on anything. The next morning, the manager informed me that my colleagues at the airport had witnessed me voluntarily entering the bathroom during the night shift. They considered it unprofessional. They decided to let me go. Although I do feel sad about the outcome, I'm also relieved that I no longer work there. The moral of this experience is to not make the same mistake I did. Just because you're a good person doesn't mean everyone else will be like you. Outside the bar. From Anonymous. I work the night shift at the local 24-hour store down the street from my home. It had been a long night, and I had about an hour left until my shift was over. I was busy sweeping the floors when I heard the sound of the bell. I looked up then, and I saw a middle-aged woman dressed in a torn skirt and top. She appeared to be in a rush, as she practically ran to the back of the store. Though strange, I wondered if I should offer her help. However, I decided to keep an eye on her and continued with my cleaning. The woman then hurried to the front desk, carrying a water bottle and a bag of chips. I quickly walked over to the counter and started scanning the items. As I did, the woman began making odd noises, like grunts or even small screams. I would glance up at her every few seconds, just to make sure she wasn't going to do something, well, dangerous. I knew it wasn't right to assume the worst, but I couldn't help myself. Finally, I finished checking out the woman, and she abruptly threw about $100 on the counter before running away. I stood there in shock, watching as she sprinted down the road as fast as she could. I picked up the cash and started to follow after her, but I was stopped by a man dressed in all black entering the store. I couldn't believe my luck. Hurriedly, I ran back to the store, realizing I'd fallen into a trap. The woman and the man were working together. She'd been pretending, tearing her skirt and making those odd noises deliberately. She left that money on the counter, luring me to follow after her, while the man robbed the store. I tried the doors, but everything was locked. Helpless, I watched as the man took as much as he could. I immediately called the police, but when they arrived and searched the area, there was no sign of the man. To this day, I still don't know what happened to him, or if they ever caught him. All I know is that I'll never work the night shift again. Ghost Resident, from Morton C. I work at a home for blind people with other handicaps. There are 3 shifts: morning, evening, and night. When I started, I primarily worked nights. It was easy, and I didn't have a lot of work to do. Most of my night involved washing clothing and cleaning the kitchenware. During the night shifts, there are only 2 people working, one on each end of the collection of houses, one for the majority of the house where the residents require almost no help during the night, and one in the house at the outskirts where the most handicapped people live, and it's in that house that my story takes place. As for the house, when you enter, there's a long hallway to your right with small apartments on the right side, and the kitchen and bathroom are on the left. At the end of the hallway, there's a small living room. To the left of the entrance, there's a small room with a washing machine and a dryer. The door in and out of the building is a large glass door. Now on to the story. When I first started, I heard rumors of weird sounds, like shuffling feet, wheels, and creaking doors. There's only one person here who can walk on her own, and she rarely, if ever, does so during the night. I didn't think much about it when I started. Having more than a few years of military service behind me, I'm not that easily scared. After a year or so, I grew used to the odd sounds here and there. It no longer seemed weird to me. So one night, when I left the washing room, I made a quick glance out of the entrance door. In the middle of the door, there was a black silhouette of a person with their arms above their head. I couldn't see any facial features, just blackness. Although it was nighttime and it was dark outside, the road between the houses was lit up by powerful streetlights, and inside the building, I'd turned on the lights, so I should have been able to see the person standing in that doorway. After the initial shock, I ran towards the door, and as I ran, the black shape disappeared. I threw the door open and looked around. The area around the door was open, and in the few seconds it took me to run those few feet, a person would not have been able to run away and out of sight. I walked around the building, looking for someone, but I couldn't find anyone. I called the other night shift worker, asking if they'd been over to the house, which they denied. When the morning shift arrived, I told them about the episode. They told me that most people only hear the sounds, but the description of the dark shape and the way I'd seen it act matched pretty well with a former resident who lived there just a year before I was hired. He had died of cancer in the house and was dearly missed by the day shift workers, so many of them could still recall him. I was assured that he was friendly and didn't do anything harmful. After that night shift, I never saw him again, but I never did feel alone either. Haunted Hotel in Eastern Sierra, California. From Bean Bean Magical Fruit. I've grown up listening to ghost stories and watching paranormal TV shows as a child. For a while there, it all creeped me out, with thoughts of a spirit lurking in the shadows of my childhood bedroom. Fortunately, as I grew older, I outgrew my fear, but not my pleasure of hearing such stories. I've never actually had what I would consider a true paranormal encounter. Most of the time, I was able to shrug it off, or find a reasonable explanation. But what happened to me recently was truly unexplainable, and brought me right back to where I was as a little kid, hiding under the covers because of a strange noise. My work sends me out into the field frequently for sampling, some of which requires overnight stays in more or less remote areas. This particular experience took place in a small town in the Eastern Sierra. This was by no means a deserted, derelict ghost town, but it was in the middle of Eastern Sierra nonetheless. After a long day of sampling in the field, I checked into my hotel room and I was ready for a relaxing evening. I ate a big dinner as well, one large burrito, 3 tacos, and a side of beans and rice. Needless to say, I was ready for an overnight food coma. I showered and brushed my teeth, then I spoke with my girlfriend on the phone for about an hour. After hanging up, it was about 9:30 p.m., and it was getting harder for me to keep my eyes open. I turned off the lights and settled into bed for the night. Quick background. The town itself was busy, given it was the beginning of summer. School was out, lots of families and tourists were out and about. The hotel I was staying in was fairly busy too. Muffled voices of nearby neighbors and footsteps came through the thin walls. It made for an oddly peaceful way to fall asleep, almost like white noise. However, things eventually quietened down, and all I could hear were the soft croaks of toads outside and the occasional big rig truck that would barrel down the main road. In between my bouts of wakefulness and sleep, I couldn't help but hear a strange tapping sound from my bathroom. At first, I chalked it up to water dripping from the shower and hitting the bottom of the pan, but it sounded too intentional, almost like a knock or finger tapping. I told myself it was just water dripping to keep my mind from running away with imagination. But things got a little stranger when I heard an odd creaking sound coming from the TV stand in front of my bed. At this point, I opened my eyes and lifted my head slightly off the pillow to scan the room. Darkness enveloped the room, and nothing out of the ordinary caught my eye. After a few more seconds of scanning, with the occasional tap and creak, I told myself it was just an old building with creaks, moans, and groans. This did calm me down a bit, as I've spent much time in lots of different hotels and haven't had anything out of the ordinary happen just yet. But this all changed very quickly. It was still dark out, but I was beginning to wake up. I tend to be an early riser due to my work, and I'll often beat my alarm clock by an hour. However, this time it wasn't my internal circadian rhythm that woke me up. It was a low, monotonous buzz. At first, I thought someone was running their shower in the room next door. As my mind slowly awakened, I soon realized it wasn't a shower, but rather the alarm clock radio next to my bed. I looked over at it and saw the time, 4:14 a.m. I put my head back on the pillow as the static continued to come through the radio. Now, this was very interesting to me, as I just listened to a story from Unexplained Encounters, where a truck driver experienced strange occurrences with his truck radio turning on by itself through the night, with just static and a voice coming through. With this in mind, instead of freaking out, I was strangely calm, waiting for a voice to come through the static. If this were 10-year-old me, I'd be busting down the door and sprinting to my parents' room. However, at that moment, I was almost curious and excited. In my mind, I kept telling myself my first paranormal encounter. It was like a milestone event for me, someone who had grown up just hearing about these stories. After a minute or so of static, I leaned over and turned off the alarm clock radio. The static quickly stopped. I lay my head back down on the pillow, and I waited for my phone alarm to go off at 5:30 a.m. Needless to say, I did not get back to sleep. I've told this story several times to several people. While most react with fear and fright, I can't help but feel proud knowing I now have a paranormal story to share. Now I know this probably isn't the most exciting story compared to others, but I'll always remember this one. It was truly unexplainable. Now I know I said I'm less fearful of the paranormal given I'm now older, but if I have to go back to that same hotel for work, I'm staying away from room 215. Trucker Serial Killer. From Anonymous. Two of my older sisters used to work as in-home caregivers to an elderly lady. My oldest sister, we'll call her A, worked the evening shift until around 8 p.m. At this time, my other sister, C, would arrive and work the overnight shift until the next morning. One night, A sat around chatting with C after her shift until it was very late. At around 10:30 p.m., she said her goodbyes and headed home. As she was leaving, she asked C to call her husband and let him know she just left because her car was acting up and she was concerned it might break down on her way home. On that night, her husband and their children were camping out in the backyard. They'd set up a tent and planned to sleep outside. So nobody was inside to answer the phone, and by the time A had headed home, they were all in fact already asleep. As A had feared, her car did indeed break down on the interstate between the town where she worked and the next town over, which is where she lived. She sat in her vehicle trying not to feel panicked. She had no cell phone at the time. She was sure that C had gotten a hold of her husband and that he would soon realize she must have broke down and would come looking for her. So she waited. After an hour or more had passed, she became worried. She only lived about half an hour away. If her husband was coming, he should have arrived by now. It was then that she noticed an 18-wheeler pulling up in front of her car. The driver got out and walked over to her vehicle, tapping at her driver's side window. She cracked the window just enough to speak, and he asked if she was okay. She replied that she was, and that her husband would soon be here to get her. He smiled at her and told her he knew she'd been sitting here for a while because he had passed by earlier on his way to make a delivery in the town where she worked. He said he'd told himself he was going to stop and check on the stranded vehicle if it was still there on his way back through. This put her at ease with him, so she rolled the window down farther to thank him and to reassure him that her husband would in fact be there soon. He argued that he couldn't just leave her there though. To do so would make him feel terrible, and he'd worry about her safety. He told her he didn't have a phone but pleaded with her to allow him to drop her off at the 24-hour gas station at the next exit. At least that way she'd be in a safe place, and she'd be able to use their phone to call someone. This was the exit she was heading to anyway, and she didn't feel like he was a threat. She thought, why not? It's better than waiting out here alone. So she accepted his offer, gathering her purse and locking up her car before climbing into the passenger side of the big rig. The man pulled out and began driving down the highway. He made some small talk with A, asking her how many kids she had, etc., the usual stuff strangers chat about. While she was chatting, she noticed he was pulling the truck over to the shoulder. They'd only gone a little over a mile. She could still faintly see her own vehicle in the side mirror. Alarmed, she asked what was going on. The driver brought the truck to a stop and left the engine idling. He stared straight ahead at the windshield and began talking, but his voice and demeanor had changed drastically. A suddenly felt that she had made a terrible decision to trust this man and that she was going to pay for it. He then said, "Your husband really isn't coming, is he?" Before she could answer, he continued, "He doesn't care about you. Nobody does. He would have already been here if he cared about you. Or someone would have come by now and noticed you hadn't gotten home. Nobody's coming, are they? If your family cared about you, they'd make sure you had a good car that wouldn't break down and leave you stranded alone out here." A began to cry, telling him firmly that her husband was on the way and she was going to get out and walk back to her car. He warned her that wouldn't be wise, that she would get hit or otherwise injured in some way. She pleaded with him to let her get out of the truck. She promised him she wouldn't say anything about this to anyone if he'd just let her go. Still staring straight ahead, he asked another question of her. "Who raised you?" Confused and terrified, she answered that her mama had raised her. The man lifted his head and sighed, a heavy sigh. He then turned away and said, "Good answer. I had a mama who raised me too, and that's the only thing saving your life tonight." At this, he produced a cell phone and handed it to her. Before letting go, he said, "Call your husband, tell him to come get you, and do not call anyone else." She did as he instructed. The phone rang and rang multiple times. She was about to give up, terrified at what that might mean, when she heard her husband's sleepy voice answer the phone at last. She explained she had broken down on the road and he needed to come get her right away. He said it would be a bit because he'd need to collect his tools so he could check her car out when he got there. Her voice shaking, but trying not to upset the trucker, she managed to say, "I'm in a big truck with a man. I need you to come right now." Her husband began to question what she was talking about, as he was not understanding that she was in real danger. She reiterated to him that he needed to come now, that she could still see her car ways back from where she was sitting in the semi-truck. The next several minutes passed by slowly and quietly, except for her own inner panic. The driver remained quiet, staring out the windshield. Suddenly, she could see a vehicle pulling up near her broke-down car in the distance. The driver saw it too and told her to get out and to go to her husband. She quickly opened the door, frantically trying to climb down from the truck, but falling down to the ground instead. She then began to run in the opposite direction toward her broke-down car and the safety of her husband's pickup. When she made it to her husband, she climbed in and demanded that he drive. The big truck ahead wasn't yet attempting to pull out. As they passed it, she didn't even want to look over and get a better look at the man or the truck. After they passed, the trucker pulled out behind them. She was soon relieved when she saw the familiar exit in sight, and he continued on past it as they took the exit instead. She tried telling her husband what had happened, but he was too concerned with scolding her for being foolish enough to enter a truck with a stranger. He half believed, or hoped, she was probably exaggerating and wasn't in any real danger. She began to feel like it was somehow her fault, and that no one would truly believe her. She never did report this to law enforcement, and only told a few trusted family members about it. To this day, I wonder if that man was a serial killer, and if he'd done this before, but others hadn't ended up as lucky as my sister. Encounter with a Demon, from Conky Joe 89. I was 26 years old when this happened. This was not my first graveyard shift job, but it was the only one where I worked alone, and it will certainly be the last one I ever work. Now, I don't mind the location being shared, and honestly, I encourage the sharing of the locale, as I'm always interested in hearing stories from my home state of Texas, and I'm especially curious as to whether anyone else has experienced anything like this. Whether it be the particular thing I encountered, or whether just under similar circumstances. Let me just say up front, I was not under the influence of any drugs, nor had I been drinking. If I'm going to be 100% forthcoming, the reason I wound up living and working where I did was that I just completed a detox and subsequent residential stay in a drug treatment program. So funnily enough, you could say I was as sober as possible. Definitely not one of the better times in my life, but we live and learn, right? Anyway, enough of my background and babbling. On to what I saw, whatever it was. I worked the graveyard shift as the maintenance man at a huge retirement community located in the town of Temple, Texas, near the end of 2015. I clocked in at 7 p.m. and clocked out at 6 a.m. The old folks didn't have to be out of what I'll call the community building and back into their own individual apartments until 9 p.m. So there would be about a 2-hour window when I showed up where the community building would have a lot of friendly older people hanging around. They'd be playing cards, chatting, exercising, that type of stuff. Couldn't be a more warm and inviting vibe, honestly. And then, like clockwork, there would be a change in energy. I'll never forget when I first became aware of it, because every shift after that, as the clock crept closer to 9 p.m., an uneasy feeling of dread and anticipation would set in on me. It was so heavy and palpable. I knew that soon I'd be isolated in that huge and quiet building, all alone. Or at least it would appear that way. There was something going on in that building. There were windows lining the entirety of the building. They looked out onto the parking lot outside, and the building was set up in a sort of U shape, or a horseshoe, so that from one hall you could look across the parking lot and see the other hallway that made up the other half of this U. I would constantly see someone or something walking along the corridors on whatever side of the building I wasn't on. It was just strange at first. I kept thinking, nah, surely it's just the blinds parted in a certain way, or no, it's just because I'm moving over here that it appears something over there is moving too. I was never successful in actually physically spotting this figure, even though on the majority of time I would see it and attempt to rush over. There was quite literally nowhere for anyone to hide or anywhere for them to go except back down the hall and past me. But I would never find anyone, only serving to further my suspicions that there was something very off going on within this place. Not necessarily anything evil or threatening, just off. Seeing as how this wasn't really a business establishment, it was more a set of communal buildings, as I said before. The employees, both daytime and nights graveyard duties, didn't really have a proper break room, as it were. So we would all use the refrigerator and the coffee prep station that was really meant for the older folks to utilize when they were having breakfast or getting snacks over the course of the day. I cannot count the number of times I'd feel like having a quick pick-me-up coffee, or maybe a complimentary carrot cake slice or 3, and when rounding the corner beside the coffee and the fridge area, a nurse from the hospice wing would either already be there or would also be rounding the corner from their side of the complex, scaring the absolute crap out of me. Just imagine it's been something like 5 or 6 hours into your shift and you haven't seen or heard a single person, voice, or anything, except that sort of phantom-like figure, the one you can never seem to truly locate. And suddenly, boom, there's someone not even 2 feet away from you, totally unexpected. Those nurses probably thought I was a very odd dude, given that every time they saw me, it would be me rounding a corner into the break area and almost having a sheer heart attack at the sight of them. Now, I'm absolutely certain I came off as the more than capable, competent, and unshakable overnight maintenance man that the community of older folks needed to keep their homes up and running all night without fail or issues arising. But as things tend to do over the weeks and months that followed, I grew accustomed to just expecting someone to be in that break area, at least once or twice over my long, dragging shift. So it eased my tensions, if only slightly. Well, that newfound sense of being able to let my guard down, and not constantly being a walking bundle of nerves, all came to an end one night when I was in what I called the dead end. Ironic, really. It was the side of the U where the hallway ended in an office, a gym room, and a physical therapy room. The other side of the U had a door that led to still more rooms and areas, so over there it felt, I don't know, less claustrophobic and isolated. But the dead end, it had an energy about it. you would always feel like something was at your back, watching, brooding. The worst part was having to run a vacuum down there, because you constantly felt the need to spin around and check your back, because you couldn't rely on sounds to alert you. Well, one day I was cleaning up the dead end. Other than that creepy feeling, it was going fairly normal. But then, something odd caught my eye. Through the window, out towards the rear parking lot, there was a dimly lit sidewalk lining the building that led around to a separate employee-only parking lot in the back. And leaning around the corner of that wall, just barely illuminated by the lamppost, which it was gripping and almost trying to conceal itself with, was a very tall, slender, half physical, half apparition, and very demonic-looking figure. This figure stood about 8 feet tall. Well, I say stood, but as you looked toward the feet, it just sort of faded away. It didn't become whole or solid-looking until about the upper thigh, the lower waist area, where it was cloaked in a garment that was tattered and thin, open in the front, revealing emaciated-looking ribs. Its arms were extremely long and thin, and it didn't seem to have 5 fingers on its hands. Instead, there were maybe 3 or 4. But it didn't have normal human hands. They were oversized, and where the fingers should have started, the flesh of this thing's hands seemed to sort of erupt into massive bone-like claws. I use the word erupt because where the claws jutted out from the hands, it's as if that flesh was newly injured, like it had just intentionally unsheathed these claws from within its hands. Yeah, think Wolverine from the X-Men type vibes. It was disgusting, and I'm pretty sure I could definitely see trickling streams of blood cascading from these claws onto the cement below. Perched atop a skinny neck was a skull-like head, sort of like cattle, but on top of its head were massive horns like a buck's. The thing simply stood there, watching me. I could feel its gaze bore into me. I was overwhelmed with nausea and dread. It sounded kind of extreme, but the only way I could describe it was that it felt like happiness was suddenly rendered a foreign concept to me. I felt as if I could never be happy again, like I had never actually been happy before. Just sad that I was leading a wasted life, that I would one day have a death that no one would mourn or even notice. It was like while I had my eyes on this thing, there was only me and it. Almost like for those few seconds, it and I stood outside of normal time or something. When I finally snapped to my senses, I literally ran away. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran my rear off. My heart was leaping into my throat. As I said before, as far as I know, all that thing did was stay there, creepily observing me. I assume it was watching me, even as I fled. From that day on, I started cleaning the dead end while there were still residents hanging about, so that hopefully I would never be put in that position again. I wouldn't last but probably a few more months at that place anyway. Then I was out of there. I'd had enough. I never did encounter that entity again, but that one time was more than enough for me. I was working in constant fear and anxiety that I would see it again, and I dreaded that the next time I saw it, it would be from a not-so-safe distance. What I saw there stuck with me. I definitely think that the fact that there was a hospice hallway on the opposite side of the same building, where we'd lose at least one person every couple of weeks or so, played a large part in attracting this entity to the location. Perhaps it was to feed on the negative energy associated with death or the dying, to feed off the feeling of hopelessness those poor people assuredly felt as they knew their life was slipping away from them. I often get unnerved even recanting this experience to anyone. This isn't the only paranormal experience I've had, far from it, but this was easily one of the most unsettling ones. The Pizza Restaurant. From Anonymous. I worked at a pizza restaurant for 6 years, my first ever job. The restaurant was practically in the middle of nowhere. I was the closing manager one night. I had to send all my coworkers home besides one. We'll call her Angie. At the time, it was about 20 minutes until closing, so I was in the dish pit and Angie was by the drive-thru window. A lady came in through the front door and went straight to the bathroom. Angie went over and waited at the front desk. She waited for about 10 minutes and then came to get me. I went over to knock on the bathroom door, asking if the lady inside needed help, and to tell her we had 10 minutes until closing. But the lady didn't come out, even after our closing time. So I called the manager over, and she told us to call the police. I went to the bathroom door and told the lady that if she didn't come out of the bathroom, then I would be calling the police. She finally came out and asked if one of us could drive her home. We told her that was against our policy. She went on to explain, "But you're the only ones here. No one would know." I pointed over to our surveillance system and told her that my manager was watching. I came up with the BS story and how the icon in the corner of the screen meant she was watching, but really it was just for recording purposes. She began to cry and told us she had no way home, that it was too cold outside to wait. We let her use the phone to call people to come get her, but no one was answering her calls. Mind you, it was 11 o'clock in the middle of nowhere, so most people were already in bed or wasted. This lady smelled as if she had just slept on the barroom floor and had done every drug under the sun. Finally, and politely, I asked her to leave the building because I had a family to get home to. She got extremely mad and began to threaten us. I'd finally had enough. I had Angie go to the back and call the cops. I told the woman what was going on, that the cops would be on their way. She was about to grab a chair when Angie came around the corner with one of our pizza knives and told her that if she touched the chair, she would throw it at her. That blade was an extremely sharp chunk of metal, and it was about 2 feet in length. The lady got scared and left. I hardly finished my closing shift and went home, scared and rattled. The following day, we found out she had crawled in the dumpster and stayed there for like 3 hours before trying to break into the storage shed. Sometimes you get the craziest customers. Close call in broad daylight. From Katie, D1230. I drive a newspaper round every night, 365 days a year, even Christmas. It's a pretty awesome gig, actually. I start at 1 a.m. and end around 5 a.m. daily. The only few times it really sucks is during snowstorms. My paper route is about half residential areas and half rural county roads. Sometimes there's a whole half mile between stops. It's dark and obviously I've seen some things that have creeped me out, but this time was different. A snowstorm had hit overnight. The country half of my route was going to have to wait until the plows came out. I returned to finish my work after the roads were plowed. Now, as a quick side note, I'm used to working in the dark. When I come across someone outside, 9 out of 10 times they're drunk or drunkened up to no good. For this reason, I carry a taser with me and a wooden dowel rod in my truck when I deliver newspapers, shifting my weapon to under my arm when I have to deliver a paper on an elderly customer's porch. It makes me feel better. Anyway, it was 11:20 a.m. in broad daylight. The sun was blaring and blinding that day. Tons of folks were outside moving snow out of their driveways. I made my way out of town to the half of my route I needed to finish. I pulled up to a customer's house that I delivered to daily for about 2.5 years. Never one complaint. As I'm putting the newspaper in their mailbox, I look up to see an old man standing in the service door of his garage with the overhead door shut. I holler over to him, "Morning, want me to run your paper to you?" I didn't want him to slip and fall. For context, I'm a 30-year-old female, 5'3", so in my mind I was trying to help this man out so he didn't have to walk all the way through the snow that had fallen on his unplowed driveway. He smiled and nodded. As I jogged down his driveway, I speak again. "Some storm, huh? Here's your paper." And I smile warmly. This man then takes 2 steps backwards into his dark garage and says, "Come in here." And he smiles. I laugh nervously. "Oh, no thank you, I have your paper for you though." still advancing my hand out holding his newspaper. "Step in here. I have something to show you," he utters. It was at this moment I realized the fresh snow had swallowed up all sound around me. I was alone with this man, standing next to his dark garage with neither of my weapons. Why would I bring them? It was just an old man in the morning. My mind began racing. I'm sure he's about to lunge and pull me into his garage. I take a step back. He takes a step towards me. He asks, "What is your name?" Trying to remain polite, I responded, "Katie." "Katie what, pretty girl?" as he smiles creepily. Katie, your paper girl," I said as I looked around at my surroundings, keeping my guard up on the man and still holding the paper. There were trees and fields nearby. There was one neighbor about a football field away. He stated one last time, "I need to show you something. Step in here." My body screamed for me to bolt away. I replied, "No, I'm already late. Have a good day." I tossed the paper and ran up the driveway. I made it to my truck. He was still standing at the door, just looking at me. I began breathing heavy and sort of freaked out at the thoughts of what he wanted to show me. The whole ordeal lasted about 2 minutes, and I delivered to this house nightly still. Now I always pull up very slowly, rubbernecking all around before opening my door to deliver the paper. Nothing since. I can't be sure, but I could have sworn that as I was running away, I heard him whisper, "Damn." College Night Shift, from Eva Fan 33. I used to work part-time at the college where I studied. I took courses in the IT field, and each semester they would hire some students to work entry-level tech positions, granting decent income and great experience. Being one of the lucky few to get a job, I didn't complain when I was rostered over to the night shift. My role was a lab proctor. Usually I was tending to computer labs, re-imaging workstations, and installing new ones. The reason there was a night shift at all was to service the instructors teaching part-time courses. There were only a few night classes, sometimes none at all, but even so, if something went wrong, we had to be there. Otherwise, a class might end up canceled. I only had one partner in the evening hours, a girl named Kira. I was fresh out of high school and she was a few years older than me, but we got along well. Similar senses of humor and all that. Things were pretty seamless for the majority of the term, until we hit the first day of December. I'm going to recount it to the best of my ability. Hopefully you don't mind the details, but I want to go as in-depth as possible. So I met Kira in a laboratory on the 3rd floor of one of the campus buildings. I'd come early, but she was already waiting for me. This was the default location for the proctors. Usually, we didn't spend much time there. We would just set our stuff down and then go follow up on tickets or jobs that were sent out. Our boss, Harry, wasn't there that night. Not like we really needed him anyway. He'd sent out an email beforehand informing us that he was not available, and he'd attached tickets we had to work on. There were 5 or 6 of them, and we had from 4 p.m. to 12 a.m. to finish them up. The first one was to re-image a lab. This meant we would be installing an operating system on each computer in a certain room. The lab was in another building. It was a large campus, and the place we'd need to head over to was about a 6-minute walk. Whenever we went out, we were supposed to take proctor phones with us. They were normal smartphones, the key difference being they had the instructor helpline forwarded to them. It was essential we carry them around to answer any call that might come up. That's why I found it weird Kira didn't take hers. She seemed to forget. So I gave her one and grabbed the other, also taking my laptop with me to update the inventory of the lab. Odd things began to happen when we stopped in the elevator. I punched the button for the ground level, and the doors closed. But before the elevator started, the two of us heard this scratching noise. That's the best way I can describe it. It sounded like an animal, maybe a raccoon, dancing on the roof of the elevator with its nails grazing the metal. I knew for a fact the sound wasn't there when I'd gone up, so I was sure it wasn't the hardware of the elevator, I made a comment about it. Kira seemed indifferent, though. In fact, she was awfully quiet. Anyway, the elevator reached the ground level without issue, and we got out. The exit was right in front of us then, and we headed through. From there, we started our walk to the building that housed the lab. The sun had already begun to set. It was the middle of winter, after all, and it was chilly. After another few minutes, we got to the building. The doors were automatically locked at 4 p.m. each day, so we needed to swipe our access cards to get in. Despite the smart security on the door, this building was a lot older than the others. The air conditioning seemed defective. It was incredibly hot and muggy when we entered. The lab in question was on the bottom floor of the building, so we took the stairs to get down. Once we made it to the lower level, we were greeted with a hallway. It was dark and rather ominous. Even worse, the lights were buggy. Only the one directly above our heads came on. The rest in the hallway started to flicker. Almost all of them were spotty and inconsistent, except for the one at the very end, which didn't turn on at all. We didn't mind terribly, though. There was enough light to make out the room designations. The lab we were looking for was right in the middle of the hallway. We walked up to it, and Kira swiped her card to open it up. Only nothing happened. The card didn't seem to trigger the reader at all. It didn't spit an error, it just ignored it. So I swiped mine, and the door opened up. As we got into the room, we noticed something bizarre. One of the computer chairs, the one at the far corner of the room, was spinning. Quickly, too. It was like someone had just slammed it as hard as they could. No one else was there, though. Even weirder, inertia should have slowed down the chair, but it just kept spinning, like its velocity was continuously being refreshed. We both looked at each other, then I went over to it, freaked out but trying not to show it. I grabbed the chair to stop it from spinning. It froze, but as it did, this sensation of ice crept over me. It was like when you swim in a pool in the middle of winter, then get out and feel the exposure on your skin. Only it was just on my arm. I must have freaked out a little, 'cause Kira asked me if I was okay. I said I was fine, and then the sensation went away. Like there one second, gone the next. After I recovered, I was going to make a comment about the chair, but she had already gotten to work, so I didn't bother, instead following her lead. It seemed to me she was having a rough night, because she fumbled with the keyboards, apparently forgetting how to open up the boot menu. So I took over her machines for her. It wasn't hard work after all. She sat down and watched me, looking very tired. It took about 15 minutes to begin the imaging process on all the computers. I read over the next ticket. It involved pulling up a workstation in a different lab back to the proctor room to diagnose it, because it had some hardware issues. I checked with Kira to make sure she was okay staying in the lab by herself. She didn't have a problem with it, so I left. I did feel uneasy about her being alone, though. I didn't really know why. Something bothered me about it, but I knew it would be redundant for both of us to wait there. So off I went. As soon as I stepped into the hallway and shut the lab door, the scratching sound returned. It was right over my head then, in the ceiling. The exact same sound from the elevator in the other building. I could hear it more clearly without the noise of the cables moving up and down. It sounded less like a raccoon and more like a dog. There was some weight to whatever creature was making the noise. It seemed to be digging, furiously, as if it was trying to get through the ceiling. I tried to ignore it and headed down the hallway, but the sound followed me. Every fluorescent light I passed turned off, like whatever was making that sound up there was cutting the wires. Paranoid, I sped up and eventually reached the end of the hallway. The noise followed, and quickly it cut off the very last light. Freaked out and a little frustrated, I yelled something along the lines of, "Enough!" And just like that, the noise went away, as if it was never there. I was really anxious at that point. I think I tried to rationalize it as I passed living between levels of the building. Just as I was about to take the stairs up to the ground level, though, I remembered Kira. My stomach dropped as I thought of her. It was the same feeling of uneasiness. Not necessarily for her safety either, I just felt strange. It's hard to explain, but anyway, I ran back down the dark hall and opened the lab door to check on her. To my dismay, she was gone. The chair she had been sitting in just before was empty, but now it was spinning rapidly just like the one from the first time we entered the room. I didn't know what to do. I was beyond freaked out. I spun around, pale as a ghost, when I heard the door to the lab unlock. Lo and behold, it was Kira. She was fine, apparently, even smiling, unlike when I had saw her previously. Then she asked me a confusing question. "Hey, why didn't you wait for me?" I blinked, confused. She told me that she had arrived in the proctor room to find it empty, with me and the phones already gone. She had to look up the first ticket to find out where I was, and then she came and found me. I just sort of stared. I must have given her this look because she was like, "What's wrong?" Then I explained to her that I had met her earlier that shift, and we headed to the lab together. She looked at me like I was stupid. She iterated again that she had been late and had to look up the room to find out where to go. I think I snapped then. I said something along the lines of, "If this is a joke, it's not funny." She asked me what I was talking about. That's when another realization set in. When you're in some freaky situation like this, you don't sweat the small stuff. You don't take in every detail. So I only realized then that Kira was wearing something totally different than what I'd seen her in before. There were two possibilities. Either this was some elaborate prank where she left, changed, and came back, all the while messing with the lights. Or there was something really bad going on. That's when I decided to check. I told her that she had taken the proctor phone and she insisted she hadn't, saying both phones were gone by the time she'd gotten there. So I took out my own phone and called the number of the proctor phone she had, fully expecting it to ring from her pocket. But it didn't. The dial tones played, but the device itself must have been too far, because we didn't hear it anywhere. Kira looked at me, annoyed, and I was about to apologize for accusing her of lying before I was cut off. Someone answered on the other side of my call. I heard nothing at first, but the dial tones had stopped, and it didn't reach voicemail, so I knew someone had picked up. Immediately, I put the phone into speaker, mouthing the word, "Listen," to her. We both stood there silently. As I turned the volume to max, we picked up on a noise. It sounded like breathing, faint but audible. Someone absolutely was there. Kira, who wasn't half as freaked out as I was, decided to say something. "Hello?" Immediately after she spoke, the breathing stopped, only to be replaced seconds later by this heaving, like laughing but dry, almost silent, the only noise coming from the diaphragm changing shape. It went on for 15 seconds. We both listened, wide-eyed, before the call dropped without warning. The other person had hung up. Kira took the phone from my hand and called back more than once, but whoever or whatever it was did not answer again. I wish I could say it ended there. I want to tell you we decided to pack it up, call it a night, and leave after that, but we didn't. Kira was headstrong, convinced it was some prankster messing with us, and I, scared as I was, wasn't going to leave her alone. So we kept working. Maybe 2 hours later, we finished up the first ticket in the lab, finalizing every install, then moved on to the second, hauling a computer back to the proctor room. Everything was good for a while. After we got the machine in the door, Kira said she was going to use the restroom. It was only a few doors down, so I didn't raise an issue. I nodded at her, moving the computer into the room to hook it up to a monitor and begin diagnosing what was wrong. When I got to the desk, though, I jumped. On the table was the missing proctor phone, the one that we had called. It was just sitting there in its usual basket. I know for a fact only me and Kira were on duty. No one else should have had access to that room, and she hadn't left my sight until we got there. So how in the world was it here? Suddenly, the door to the room slammed. I'd left it open so she wouldn't have to swipe to get in, and it slammed hard. I knew someone had pushed it. Now focused less on fear and more on my coworker's safety, I got up, running over to the door and yanking it open. I was met with a dark hallway, like totally dark. The overhead lights that were up 24/7 were all offline. The only reason I could see at all was because of streetlights seeping into the mini glass panels of the building. Focusing, I turned my phone's flashlight on. It was pitiful in the huge college hallways, but it made them walkable. I called Kira's name. There was no response, so I began walking to the restrooms. On my way, I passed by a classroom and the door creaked open as I walked. It was so eerie, slow and drawn out, like a horror film. I found it impossible that a door like that could have been so terribly lubricated. Regardless, I continued on. The washroom was just up ahead. I used my phone to identify which of the doors were for women. It was held open by a door stopper, so I entered. I called Kira's name again. Still, no reply. I felt a little weird about going into a female bathroom, but given the circumstances, I really had no other choice. Shining my light around the room revealed no one. It was small. I could see almost every corner, and Kira was not there. The only thing amiss about the room was the stall door. It was swinging back and forth, making no noise at all. Just like the chairs from before, it showed no sign of slowing down. I remember being mesmerized by it, standing still to watch it glide. I was snapped back into reality from the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Immediately, I shot back out, calling for Kira again. By the time I'd exited the restroom, the footsteps were already down the corridor and behind a corner. It sounded like the other person, whoever it was running. So I ran after them. It was like something from a cartoon. No matter how fast I ran, they always stayed a little ahead of me. I could never quite reach the person, but I was always close enough to follow. I was led up and down stairs, down all sorts of different hallways until finally, it stopped. I was huffing and puffing as I turned past the last corner. There was only one door there, and it was ajar. I recognized it as one of the School of Health classrooms. I caught my breath, now irritated that I'd been led around the school. Then I walked up, shouldering the door open. The room was entirely dark. I reached over for the manual light control, flicking it up. It was able to override whatever had kept the hallway lights off, and it turned on, illuminating the room. Oh man, I wish I didn't flick the light switch on. There were skeletons. I don't mean real skeletons. It's one of those models you've probably seen in science classrooms. About the same size as a human one, but made out of plastic or some composite material. Anyway, in every single chair sat a model skeleton. They were all turned to face me. It was horrifying. Who the heck had set up all these, and when? As I took a step backward from them, there was an ear-splitting noise. I blinked, and every jaw fell off the skeletons in unison, clacking to the floor, like they were all severed off. There I was, being stared down by an army of jawless model skeletons. Right away, I noped out of there. As I ran, I could have sworn I heard plastic joints cracking as if they were pursuing me. I took the nearest exit, pushing out of the building into the cold night air. I remember taking a minute to catch my breath and process what the heck had just happened. I wanted to run, so badly I wanted to run, but Kira was still in there somewhere. She wasn't picking up her phone. I even called our boss Harry, but he didn't respond either. At that point, I was fed up. I think I was going to call the police, but was trying to work out how to get across my story without sounding insane. Then, something caught my attention. I could see a shape moving, but not very quickly. It was very timid. It was obviously a girl. Kira. Even in the low light, I knew it was her because of the short crop of her hair. She walked out of the shadow and onto the path. It was so weird. 10 feet away, she faced away from me, dead center in the middle of the walkway. I remember calling out to her. I wasn't thinking. If I was thinking, I would have known something wasn't quite right. But I was too worried about her, and too glad to see her again to be careful. I said her name, and then she started heaving. Facing away from me, she was doing this convulsive motion, like she was hysterically laughing. only there was absolutely no sound coming from her. None. It went on for minutes, the same horrifying movement. I backed up, slowly to the door I'd exited from, automatically swiping my door and pushing on through. When I turned back only a few seconds later, she, if you can call it that, because it obviously wasn't Kira, had disappeared from the path. As soon as she was gone from my view, the lights turned back on. The entryway of the building was illuminated once more, as were all the hallways. I could move about again without my phone's flashlight. Very carefully, I headed upstairs as quiet as I could, then to the Proctor room. My plan was to grab my stuff and book it out of the building, calling the police on my way. Quickly, I swiped the card and shouldered my way into where my backpack was. Kira was waiting for me. She had the computer we'd brought on a table with its side panel off. She was busy working on it. She didn't even turn her head to me, only saying something like, "Oh, hey." I was so glad to see her, the real her, that I ran up and hugged her. She asked what the heck I was doing, and I told her I'd gone searching for her when the lights shut off. Before I could ramble about the person running through the halls and the model skeletons, and the other version of her that was doing that heaving thing, she cut me off. She told me that when the lights shut off, she left the bathroom and came back to the Proctor office to find me. Apparently, she began working on the computer, and I mumbled something about completing another ticket before I walked out of the room. And after that, despite her protests, I made us pack everything in. We grabbed our things and left, Kira complaining the entire time. I never gave her a real explanation. I couldn't. I just needed to get us both out of there. That's really it. I'm sorry for the length of this story. I wish I could give some detailed explanation or round off with some cliché about seeing a silhouette standing inside one of the buildings as we left. But I can't. It ended as quickly and strangely as it began. The only reason I remembered this story is because Kira hit me up recently. We hadn't seen each other since the beginning of the Rona thing, and she wanted to reconnect. We planned to meet up next weekend to get drinks. In her text, she joked about finding out why I made us leave that night. I thought drafting this up might help me find the words to explain it to her, if I decide to explain it at all. As for what entity or phenomenon was in motion that night, I haven't a clue. Maybe someone out there does know, though, and will heed my story as a warning. I do know that whatever it was sincerely enjoyed freaking me out, though. Take that how you will. Good luck on your night shifts, everyone, and stay safe. Haunted and Unwanted at Walmart, from Chronic Adventure. When I was about 20 to 21 years old, I used to work at Walmart as janitorial and maintenance overnight. The job included usual cleaning and overnight cart gathering. Now, a few bizarre things happened to us. Products falling off of shelves, disembodied voices, etc. But there were 3 very unusual occurrences. The first one happened on a New Year's night. We had a guy go running through our store while being chased by police officers. In the midst of this, me and 2 other coworkers were in the back room doing our usual work, when suddenly gunshots were fired towards us. Luckily, we were just fine. More terrifying was the man who was screaming threats at all of us. Another major experience was when we would go out to collect carts. We weren't allowed to be out there alone, we'd have to have 2 or more people at least. Well, I went out and was told that my buddy there would be outside soon. Within 5 minutes, a person pulled up in a Jeep, and he looked like he had been doing substances. He tried to lure me over to his car. Of course, I never went near him, and because I refused to go over there, he pulled a pistol on me and aimed it at me. I froze. Slowly, I reached for my walkie-talkie, but then luckily my coworker came out. Then the guy in the car sped away. Lastly, on a Halloween night, my coworker and I were cleaning the bathrooms. Earlier that night, we were hearing a lot of different noises, nothing out of the normal. Now, in the past, there have been people who had killed themselves in our store. I don't have many details on this, but I always believed because of it, our store was extremely haunted. But while cleaning the bathrooms, the lights suddenly flipped off, which was weird, but then I heard my coworker laughing. Maybe it was a joke, I thought. My coworker turned the lights back on, and I looked in the mirror. There, staring back at me, was a black shadow with a yellow-toothed grin. We'd been closed for 2 hours by then, so it couldn't have been a customer. I screamed and ran out of the bathroom. But since that day, I would occasionally see shadows out of the corners of my eyes. Not too often, though. I'm happy to say that I never saw whatever that was, ever again. A sleepover with a predator. From Sai. The memory of that stormy night still sends chills up my spine to this day. It goes to show that you can't trust anyone, no matter how much you think you know them. I was 21 years old at the time, and I had just graduated from Bible college. I moved up to my first job as a youth pastor in rural Indiana. It was a very small town. There was a gas station, a small coffee shop, a school, a good-sized park, and the small church I just landed a job at. Things were tough at first, because I'm originally from the Southeast, and now I lived hundreds of miles away in a place where I knew absolutely no one. That was until I met him. His name was Ray, and we hit it off quick. He was in charge of the elementary school kids at the church, and I primarily worked with the teenagers. Since we were both considered to be in the youth department, we'd often find ourselves having lunch meetings, going on walks after work to talk about life, and would watch TV shows at each other's houses. There was one night Ray slept over at my house to watch a movie with me, and I was a bit grossed out to see him come out of my bathroom after changing into his PJs, which turned out to be nothing but tighty-whities. At first I was glad to have a friend, but after a while I felt more and more uncomfortable with Ray. The first thing that would make someone uneasy was Ray's appearance. He was very tall. He stood about 6'6", and he had very long, slender arms and legs, but his torso was very heavy. He was kinda similar to those cartoon frogs in the old Looney Tunes cartoons. His face was a little chubby, nearly bald, and he had glasses. You'd think a guy that was this big would have a deep voice, but it couldn't be farther from the truth. Rather, he had a very high-pitched voice and spoke to me and others like a mother would speak to a small child. Ray also had a lot of tics, where he would randomly convulse his head and shoulders, and he would stick out his seemingly 7-inch long tongue whenever he'd have those random muscle spasms. I ignored all this, because I've always tried to be one to judge people for their character, not their physical appearance. Plus, Ray helped me move in and assisted me in painting my new place, so I felt bad for judging a guy like that. But it was disturbing nonetheless. Even though his appearance and tics made me feel weird, it was his weird obsession with me that really made my heart sink. He would constantly ask me to hang out every waking moment. There would be times I would go to the bathroom and come out to find 11 or 12 missed calls from him. Most of the time he reached out, I felt obligated to go, but it was always weird. Whether it was sitting with him and talking for hours while he worked at his mom's cake shop, inviting me to watch lame TV shows instead of manly ones, or interrupting my video game sessions with a call to talk about how much he wanted babies one day, all of these interactions were pushing me away. There was even one time he asked me to go shopping with him, and I told him that I only had time for the one store he suggested, because I had a teen church service that evening. He said, okay, that's fine. After we shopped and got back into his car, he locked the doors and drove me around, laughing and saying, "You're not going anywhere, you're staying with me, everyone loves Ray." After an hour of this maniac driving me around aimlessly and blasting music, I yelled, "Take me back to church." Ray was enraged that I yelled, and he punched me square in the groin. It hurt so bad. I squeaked with whatever voice I had left, "I can't stand you anymore." He was quiet for the rest of the drive back. Ray had driven me around so long that I ended up arriving late to church for my teen service. To make things worse, there were a bunch of angry parents who had been waiting to drop their kids off for nearly 45 minutes. At that moment, I knew I was done. I'd had enough. The next time Ray asked me to do something, I told him I couldn't. I was done with Ray. But he apparently wasn't done with me. He called and texted almost every night with non-stop crying and begging. It was so unnatural sounding for a 27-year-old man. The best way I can describe it is like a middle school girl begging their boyfriend to stay after a breakup. And then the sadness turned to passive aggressiveness when we would see each other at church. There were even times on Sunday morning during the pastor's sermon that I would look over and Ray would be staring at me with this creepy expressionless face. He wasn't listening or paying attention to the message at all. He just sat there glaring at me with this glazed over look of pain and numbness. But I couldn't help but feel he was fantasizing about something else, something insidious. Eventually, Ray quit his job at the church, got a job as a school teacher, and seemed to make new friends. I thought, finally, Ray has new friends to pester. I was in the clear. It felt as if a huge dark cloud had lifted and the sun shined on me once again. A year passed by. I was now married and had my first child. I'd almost completely forgotten about Ray when, out of the blue, he called me up and asked to catch up. He seemed a lot cooler, like maybe his new teacher friends had really helped him become more normal. We grabbed lunch, and he asked if I wanted to come to his school's football game. I thought, Ray wants to watch football? Finally, something manly. My wife was going to be out of state with our baby visiting family, so I thought, what the heck, and I agreed to go. While we were at the game with his teacher friends, it began to rain shortly into the second quarter. Before we knew it, there was a full-blown thunderstorm with high winds, so the school announced that the game was canceled and sent everyone back to their cars. When Ray and I reached our vehicles, a tornado siren began to blare, and because I lived nearly an hour away, he suggested I come back to his house to seek shelter. Tornadoes in the Midwest are not something to mess around with, so naively, I agreed and followed him home. This turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes in my life. Such a big mistake that I would rather have taken my chances with the tornadoes. I could barely see, and what should have taken 5 minutes took 15 minutes. When we arrived, Ray showed me around his place. The house was a little creepy and ornate looking, with a lot of old dolls and thrift store looking knickknacks. Even though the decor was weird, the evening started off fine. We watched some home improvement shows, had some snacks and some drinks. It was actually a pretty relaxing way to weather the storm, and definitely beat driving 20 miles an hour in heavy rain for several hours, or so I thought. At around 12:30 a.m., the storm was still raging, so we decided to turn in for the night. I asked Ray if I could have a pillow and blanket to sleep on the couch in the living room. He said, no, let's sleep in my room. There's plenty of space in there. But I told him the couch would be more comfortable for me. He kept insisting over and over, so reluctantly, I agreed. The floor in his room was so hard, and all he gave me was this tiny Winnie the Pooh kid's blanket and a flat pillow. I was tossing and turning for what felt like hours. At 2 a.m., Ray's voice spoke in the pitch-black room. You know, you can hop up here in bed with me if you want. There's plenty of room. I said no, firmly, and kept tossing and turning. About 30 minutes later, he asked again, Are you sure? It's really fine. I don't know what came over me, but I was so tired and my back hurt so bad that I hopped into bed. After lying there on my back staring into the darkness, I noticed he kept trying to scoot close to me. I figured he was just asleep, so I inched away a little. This happened several times until I was basically hanging off the bed. He scooted one more time and I turned my back to him. I held really still to act like I was asleep. It got really quiet. Then, out of nowhere, I feel both of his long, skinny arms wrap around me, and he pulls me into his flabby chest. Ray began squeezing me like a python and rubbed his sandpapery cheek on my forehead. I shot out of the bed, somehow breaking free from the grasp of this freak. I grabbed my pillow and blanket, and I lay on the couch after flushing the toilet to play it off like I had to go to the restroom. I was counting down the seconds until the storm ended, so I could make a mad dash to my car and get the heck out of there. My mind was racing as I thought about what the crap just happened in there. I was so repulsed by what Ray did to me, and I felt filthy for even being in the same vicinity of his bed. I lay there on the sofa beside sliding glass doors in the pitch-black living room. There's absolutely zero light except the occasional flash of lightning, and the sound of the downpour and thunder was deafening. This is the moment that still gives me nightmares to this day. As I lay there staring into the pitch blackness, my back facing the window so I could watch towards Ray's room. The lightning flashed, and I about soiled myself, I kid you not. I saw the black silhouette of Ray standing in the doorway. A few minutes passed by. I was frozen like a statue. My heart felt as if it was going to beat out of my chest. I had to act like I was asleep. I couldn't move a muscle. Then the lightning flashed a second time, and I almost passed out to the sight, which I can only describe as a fat, slender man that all of a sudden appeared right above me. My blood ran cold as I held my breath. He bent down with his weird lullaby he was humming. He sniffed my hair and smiled with a little chuckle, then went back to his room, whispering to himself, "I'll see you again." That was the biggest nope in my entire life. As soon as I heard his door shut, I sprang up in an instant, ran down the stairs into the basement, out the back door, and sprinted to my car through the pouring rain. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I felt like he was right behind me, as if his long arms could wrap around me at any moment. As I tried to crank the car, I couldn't get it to start. I fiddled with the keys and locked up steering wheel until I heard the sweet sound of the engine fire up. As I looked up to drive, there he was again, standing in the back doorway like Slender Man. I've never driven so fast in the rain in my life. My wife and I have moved away to work at a larger church in the city, and things have been a lot less eventful, thank goodness. Ray tried to call several times before we moved away, but I never answered. Eventually, the calls and the texts stopped, and I've never spoken to Ray again. I don't know why I was so naive. I guess I just always tried to see the best in people. But I can't help but wonder what Ray would have done to me if I really did fall asleep in his bed. Was that what he was thinking about as he stared at me in church those days before he left? It just goes to show that you can never trust someone, even if you think you understand them fully. Be careful out there and watch out for predators, because they come from places you'd least expect. It came with the fog. Faint but audible. Someone absolutely was there. Kira, who wasn't half as freaked out as I was, decided to say something. "Hello?" Immediately, to tell you, we decided to pack it up, call it a night, and leave. Was running, so I ran after them. It was like something from a cartoon. No matter how fast I ran, they always stayed a little ahead of me. I could never quite reach the person, but I was always close enough to follow. I was led up and down stairs, down all sorts of different hallways, until finally, it stopped. But I told him the couch would be more comfortable for me. He kept insisting over and over, so reluctantly, I agreed. My company, where I spent over 10 years, ran into financial problems. When I thought that was the end of it, one night I fell asleep behind the wheel, ran off the road, and destroyed my already miserable car, the repairs of which I paid literally the last money I had. I ended up alone in a small, ugly apartment that I was renting, crying and feeling sorry for myself. Most of the people I considered friends turned their backs on me and left me alone at the mercy of my depression that had me tightly in its claws. My wake-up call was when I realized I would soon be homeless if I continued like this much longer. That's when I decided it was enough. I didn't need anyone, and I would get back on my feet. Since I'm a prisoner of a small, dying but once very lively mining town, I was in no position to choose the job I liked, except what was offered at the time. So I agreed to a new job at a nearby dairy farm. The job description was this: preparing and taking cows for milking and other related tasks. It's not something you fantasize about as a little girl, but when you're desperate and need money, unfulfilled childhood dreams are the least of your worries. Plus, the job wasn't bad at all. It just took a little bit of time to get used to the sounds, smells, and other charms a farm has to offer. One day, my boss gathered us all together, asking if any of us would be willing to work the night shift until he hired someone new for the job. Before he could even finish the question, I had my hand in the air. Changing to nights meant that I would get a better salary for way less work. Basically, all I would have to do is be physically present and make sure that everything was in order, that the cows were alive and undisturbed. If something really did happen, I could just call the boss. And if a pregnant cow went into labor, I could just call the vet. And that was that. Although the boss wasn't too thrilled with the idea since no one else came forward, he didn't have much choice. Honestly, the first few nights I wasn't comfortable being alone on that farm. But after I got over my fear, I started to really enjoy the place and the fresh night air. My boss planned my duties so that when I arrived, I would settle in a small, well, let's call it an office. And every once in a while, I would take a walk around the place to see if everything was okay. During one of those walks, a genius idea hit me, which I very quickly put into action. I made a small fortress out of hay bales, and instead of being in the office, I was chilling in my new spot. Most of the time, I would read books with a small headlamp, and the best part was that I didn't have to walk anymore, because in case something happened, I would hear everything from my little fortress. One night, just as I was starting a new book, footsteps began to echo in the dead silence of the farm. Loud, specific footsteps that I knew immediately where they were coming from. In front of one of the barns was a large patch of dirt, and at the moment there was a bunch of mud there. The kind of mud that would torture you fairly well before letting you go through it. I could hear a splash, splash. There was no doubt someone was in front of the barn. I wasn't really scared. I expected to find someone from a nearby town trying to steal some oil from one of the mini machines, and I would just tell them to go away before calling the police. It was only when I peeked out from my fortress when I noticed a thick fog had begun to cover every corner of the farm. I bravely started making my way towards the unknown intruder, but to my surprise, there was no one there. It wasn't possible for someone to run away that quickly. As I said, that thick mud does not let go easily. I should have either found someone there, or at least heard them desperately attempting to get out of the mud. Confused and slightly doubting my own ears, I went back to my position and listened carefully. All I heard was silence. I decided to call my brother, because at the time he was in the phase of hardcore gaming and I knew he'd be awake still. I needed to hear a familiar voice. I needed a logical explanation to calm me down a bit. Of course, he told me it was probably nothing, that I was just tired and that my brain was playing tricks on me. He said if someone was really there by now, I would have heard something else. Fully relieved by my brother's words, I went back to my book. I don't know exactly how much time passed, but judging by the pages I read, I would say at least an hour or two, when the silence was disturbed once more. This time, not by footsteps echoing through the farm, but rather a totally unknown, eerie, and somewhat irritating sound that I would best describe as gargling and slurping, somehow at the same time. I didn't dare to move, as the sound was coming closer and closer, then stopped right in front of my little fortress. I stayed there like a statue, my heart in my throat, and a disgusting bitter taste filling my mouth. I had absolutely no idea what to do. Yeah, I guess you're right. Maybe we can hang out tomorrow. Well, then give me a call when you wake up. I love you. Those were the words that woke me up from my trance. Those were my words. That was my voice. Because that's exactly what I'd said to my brother on the phone earlier. When it finally hit me that the footsteps I heard were in fact real, that they belonged to this whatever the thing was, that all this time I'd been convincing myself I was alone on the farm, this thing was hidden somewhere nearby, and that it was now speaking to me in my voice, and the only thing standing between us was a single bale of hay. I jumped out of my fortress like a bullet and ran into the night, praying to God that I didn't get lost while trying to find my car in the thickest fog I've ever seen. It didn't take me too long to find the car. When I made it, I just sat down, locked myself in, and desperately tried to put the key in the ignition with trembling hands. I then felt and heard something brush against the car. I managed to start the car, and more than anything I wanted to press in the gas, but because of the darned fog, I was forced to move at a crawling pace, and the entire time I could feel light pushes and hear tapping on the back window of the car. I'm not sure when it all stopped, because I was crying and sobbing so loud it was all I could hear at that point. When I felt I'd driven far enough, I called my boss and I tried to explain what happened. But I don't think I managed to say a single word that made sense, and he had no idea what happened or what I was even talking about. But by then I didn't care. I just wanted to go home and hide under a blanket. In the morning when I heard my phone ring, I immediately knew it was my boss calling, that he would want to see me, and that I would likely get fired. But first I would be forced to listen to his speech about how I shouldn't have pushed myself for a job that I wasn't ready to do. But I was wrong. He wasn't mad at all, and I soon found out that the horror story didn't end with me running away from the farm. After my crazy call, my boss came to the farm and tried to find out what had happened. However, due to the thick fog, the only thing he could do was go around the barns. In one of them, he found a dead cow. At first glance, nothing strange. It happens, unfortunately. Except this was one of the pregnant cows, and her belly had been ripped open, the abdominal cavity completely empty. No calf, not a single organ, not a drop of blood, a stain, a print, no sign of a struggle. Nothing. Just a dead animal, surrounded by dozens of other cows that were now calmly munching on hay and didn't seem the least bit upset. How was it possible to walk among so many animals, tear open one's belly, take out so much content in total silence, then walk away without leaving any trace? Although I was returned back to my milking job, my financial situation was still bad, so I didn't last long there. I've never believed in the paranormal before. I've never been a person that gets easily scared. But that night changed everything for me. I didn't feel comfortable working when I knew that maybe I was being watched by something that was just waiting for the right moment to grab me. Then, instead of a cow, I would be left dead, found with a torn open belly, completely empty on the cold, dirty floor.